18, roll 18. This is roll 18, take 1.
How long did it take the ordinary Cambodians to really get themselves involved in the war effort?
When the Cambodian War first started, it was a war against the Vietnamese communists. And that continued for about 2 years, so that immediately the Cambodians felt very patriotic about it. There was a very moving, a spontaneous feeling of patriotism, nationalism. They were fighting their traditional enemies. The Cambodians were fighting the Vietnamese, and they are traditional enemies. So that they had no need for conscription. They had no need to draft their soldiers. They had too many volunteers, including young boys and girls. Boy soldiers, we called them, sometimes only 12 or 14 years old, and girls, many of whom were university students. Some of those became girl paratroopers and good frontline fighters, all of them.
How big was the army when they first got involved in the war?
The Cambodian army in 1970, when they went into the war, numbered only 30,000. They were ill-equipped, not very well trained, almost totally inexperienced. But they went in with a great spirit.
I think we better cut
Yeah. This is roll 18, take 2, I think it is.
How big was the Cambodian army when the war first started?
When the war started, the Cambodian army only numbered 30,000. They were ill-equipped, very poorly equipped, very inexperienced. They'd been building roads most of the time. They were a people's army. They hadn't fought a war on any scale for 20 or 30 years. So they were thrown straight in against the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong, one of the best armies and most experienced fighters in the world. But there was a great feeling of patriotism and nationalism because they were fighting against their traditional enemies, the Vietnamese.
Were flags of the same symbolic importance to the Cambodians as they were to the Vietnamese?
There was a great deal of symbolism in their flags, because the Cambodian flag has always had the towers of Angkor Wat, the 12th century temple palace of the great kings of Cambodia. Even the communists used a similar flag. There was a great deal of symbolism in the flags in Cambodia. They always depicted Angkor Wat, the great 12th century temple city. But it was something like in the 18th century, that feeling of centuries gone by, of wars fought when soldiers walked to meet their enemy in blocks of 4 by 4 or 3 by 3, disdaining to take any cover. And invariably, the Cambodian flag was carried in front of the advancing troops by a young boy, generally. If he was killed, and he was usually among the first killed, it was a race to see who had the honor of carrying the flag in front of the troops again. It was a very warm feeling in one way. It was also very, very sad, because they were fighting an enemy who paid scant regard to the old-fashioned way of fighting.
Why did the Cambodians get themselves involved in the war in the first place?
The Cambodians didn't want to be in the war. They were very happy. It's a very peaceful country. They were dragged into the war mainly by the United States of America, by President Nixon and Dr. Henry Kissinger. I think we just got 2 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Kim. This is reel 18, I think it is, slate 3.
Why did the Cambodians get involved in the first place in the war?
They didn't want to be involved in the war at all. The Americans dragged them in, President Nixon particularly, and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger. They were mainly responsible for Cambodia entering the war. Of course, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese had sanctuaries in eastern Cambodia. The Americans, for a long time, had wanted to attack those sanctuaries, and wipe them out. They thought that by dragging Cambodia into the war on their side, involving the Cambodians, that they would be successful and eventually win the war in Indochina. The only thing they were successful in doing was in almost totally destroying 1,200 years of civilization, that is the Cambodian culture and the Cambodian people.
But nevertheless, the Cambodians did allow the sanctuaries to be on their territory, and so therefore they were encouraging the North Vietnamese, the Viet Cong.
The Cambodians had little choice but to allow the North Vietnamese and communist sanctuaries in general on their soil. They had a very small army. They had attacked the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese continually. So the same way they attacked the South Vietnamese and the Americans, who from time to time made attacks on those sanctuaries inside Cambodia. The poor Cambodians at times were fighting the Viet Cong, the North Vietnamese, the Americans and the South Vietnamese forces, and nothing they could do about it. They were a very small army, a very small country, only 7 million people.
So what was Kissinger's philosophy behind involving Cambodia in the war?
Kissinger believed that by bringing Cambodia into the war on the side of Vietnam, South Vietnam and America and its allies, that they would be able to build up the Cambodian army and so crush the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong in those sanctuaries between South Vietnam and Cambodia.
Give that to me again. Why do you think that? Why did Kissinger involve Cambodia in the war?
Kissinger believed that if he brought Cambodia into the war on the side of America and South Vietnam against the communists, then he would be able to crush the communist sanctuaries where the VC and the North Vietnamese were in great strength in eastern Cambodia and safe for most of the time. He would crush them and therefore wipe out their base camps, make it more difficult, even impossible for them to operate. But it didn't work that way because the communists came out of their sanctuaries and quickly overran most of Cambodia because the Cambodians had nothing really to fight with.
Why did he follow a policy of saturation bombing?
The Americans in general followed a policy of saturation. The Americans generally followed a policy of saturation bombing. They believed that enough bombs could wipe out the communist forces below and their base camps and their storage depots, ammunition caches, things like that. It never did work, but the Americans continued and continued and continued to do this. Of course, President Nixon and Henry Kissinger in 1969 were deeply involved in what is known as the secret bombing of Cambodia, a totally illegal act in which many, many Cambodian civilians were killed and very few communist troops, I think, were killed.
So in view of this, what are your opinions of Kissinger?
If one takes the past, that is, if one takes the past into account, remembering that Japanese and German politicians and military people faced war crimes tribunals, well then, given that as a criteria, Henry Kissinger was a war criminal, as was Richard Nixon.
That aside, do you regard them as being war criminals?
Personally, it's very difficult for me to judge them as such. On the other hand, they did deceive the American people, and they were responsible for Cambodia and what they were.
Give me a gut reaction. I mean, do you think they were guilty of war crimes or not?
I dislike Henry Kissinger and President Nixon mainly for that facet of their behavior. By illegal and duplicity, by their duplicity, Kissinger and Nixon.
I want a better word than duplicity. It's not good enough. I don't understand it.
I believe that the action of President Nixon and Kissinger in dragging Cambodia into the war was a criminal act. If you want to classify that as a war crime, I'm not going to argue about it. The Americans were getting out of Vietnam, but with Nixon's invasion of Cambodia in 1970, the war there was only just beginning. Maybe.